It's behind you.
The fog came alive on a Tuesday, which should have meant nothing, but somehow made it worse. Nothing ever happened on Tuesdays in Greyhaven. The town had built its identity on that kind of predictability. Weather changed, people aged, buildings decayed, but nothing arrived. Nothing crossed the invisible line that separated Greyhaven from stories worth telling. Until the fog did. It didn't roll in like weather usually does. It didn't creep or drift or swirl dramatically. It simply appeared, as if the air had thickened all at once, as if the space between things had decided to close. By midday, the sky lost its color. By afternoon, sound began to dull. Footsteps felt padded. Voices didn't carry. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as though unsure whether it was welcome. People noticed the silence before they noticed the fog. Birds vanished first. Then insects. Dogs stopped barking, not because they were calm, but because they were afraid. They pressed themselves into corners, trembling, refusing to look outside. Livestock pulled against their tethers until ropes frayed and posts bent. Something in the fog made animals understand what humans couldn't yet name. The fog was wrong. It wasn't cold. It wasn't wet. It wasn't blind. It reacted. When people opened their doors, it waited. When cars slowed, it thickened. When someone waved a hand through it, the mist parted, then closed again a moment too late, like it was replaying the movement in its memory. No one said that out loud at first. They didn't have the words yet. They just felt the unease crawl up their spines and settle there, quiet and patient. Mrs. Calder was the first to say she saw someone inside it. Her husband had died 3 years earlier. Heart failure. Quiet, unremarkable. She swore she saw him standing across the street, half-formed, his outline blurred but familiar. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He didn't move at all. He just stood there, facing her house, as if waiting for her to notice. When she blinked, he was gone. By evening, the fog had learned faces. People began to feel watched, not from behind, not from above, but from within the fog itself. Mirrors fogged over from the outside. Windows developed slow, steady condensation that pulsed like breathing. When you turned away from the glass, the pressure didn't leave. It lingered, heavy behind the eyes, like something had leaned close enough to memorize you. Those who stared into the fog for too long noticed something else. It stared back. Not with eyes. With attention. Elias Moore volunteered to walk into it. He was town watch, the kind of man people trusted because he never raised his voice and never panicked. He said fear was contagious, that fog was fog, that weather didn't watch people. He took 3 calm steps into the mist, lifted a hand, and smiled to prove nothing was there. The fog accepted him. Not violently. Not suddenly. It simply closed. When his boots were found the next morning, they stood neatly at the edge of the street, toes pointed inward, as if he had stopped running, if he had ever run at all, and decided to listen. That was when the old rule surfaced. No one remembered learning it. No one remembered teaching it. But everyone knew at the moment it was spoken, like a truth that had been waiting for language. Never acknowledge the fog. Never describe what you see inside it. Never answer if it calls you. Because the fog doesn't take bodies. It takes permission. The fog began to speak after that. Not loudly. Not clearly. It used familiar sounds. Footsteps that matched your own. Voices that knew how your name was supposed to be said. Memories whispered just well enough to feel like thoughts you hadn't meant to remember. People answered without realizing they had. A word. A breath. A single acknowledgement. That was enough. The fog changed. It sharpened. It grew intentional. It learned shape. People vanished quietly. No screams. No struggle. Just absence. Houses stayed locked. Meals stayed half-cooked. Lives paused mid-sentence and never resumed. Those left behind began to understand something far worse than invasion. The fog hadn't come to Greyhaven. Greyhaven had been marked. Long ago. When the fog finally thinned weeks later, the town pretended to heal. Streets cleared. Windows opened. Conversations resumed. People learned how to speak without saying certain things, how to look without looking too long. Life returned, but lighter, like something essential had been hollowed out. Even now, when the air is clear, something remains. A pressure. A patience. A sense of being known. Because the fog never left. It only learned how to wait. And if you're listening to this story alone, late, in a quiet room, pay attention to the space behind you. Not because something is there yet, but because it remembers the moment you first noticed it. The fog came alive once. It does not need to do so again. No one noticed the staring at first, because everyone was looking for eyes. That was the mistake. We are trained to fear what looks back at us. Faces, pupils, reflections that blink when we don't. But whatever moved through the fog that night did not need eyes to see. It did not need a face to recognize us. It watched in a way that had nothing to do with vision. It watched by knowing. The fog arrived just after sunset, when the world was already preparing itself for darkness. Streetlights flickered on, one by one, and then began to dim, as though embarrassed by how little they revealed. The mist slid between buildings without sound, without urgency. It behaved less like weather and more like a presence finding its place in the room. People stood still when they noticed it. Not frozen by fear. Paused by instinct. Something in the air suggested that movement was being recorded. The first man who said he felt it described it poorly. He said it was like standing too close to someone in the dark. Like feeling breath on your skin without hearing breathing. Like knowing, without any evidence, that something had leaned close enough to count your heartbeats. Others laughed it off. Until they felt it too. Windows fogged from the outside, slowly, deliberately. Not all at once. One pane at a time. As if something was pressing its attention against each surface, deciding which one mattered. People wiped the glass clean only to find the mist returning immediately, thicker where their hands had been, lingering as though confused by touch. That was when they realized the truth. The fog did not look through windows. It looked at them. Children reacted first. They always do. A little girl stood in her doorway, staring into the fog with her head tilted, listening to something no one else could hear. When her mother asked what she was doing, the girl answered without blinking. "It knows me already." No one slept that night. Not because of noise. Not because of movement. But because of the sensation that sleep would be noticed. That closing your eyes was an invitation. People lay still in their beds, staring upward, afraid that if they drifted too far, something would finish memorizing them. The staring intensified after midnight. It pressed against walls. It leaned into corners. It occupied spaces just outside direct attention, retreating slightly whenever someone turned their head too quickly. Mirrors became unbearable. Reflections felt delayed, as if waiting for instruction. More than one person covered their mirrors entirely, only to wake later and find the cloth damp, heavy, and warm. Still, no eyes appeared. No shapes. No silhouettes. Just awareness. Then the fog learned how to stand still. That was when the disappearances began. No struggle. No sound. A chair left pulled out. A door left ajar. A room that felt recently occupied in a way that made your stomach turn. Those who vanished were not taken while running or screaming. They were taken while pausing. While hesitating. While standing somewhere familiar and feeling, just for a moment, that they were not alone. Someone finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. How does it see us? The answer came not as words, but as understanding. It didn't see bodies. It saw attention. It felt when you noticed it. When your thoughts lingered. When fear sharpened your awareness and pointed it outward. Every second you acknowledged its presence, you defined yourself more clearly against the fog, and clarity made you easier to keep. Those who survived learned to move differently. Slowly. Casually. Never reacting too quickly. Never staring. Never acknowledging the pressure behind the eyes. They learned to behave as if nothing was wrong, because pretending ignorance was the only camouflage left. Even then, the staring never stopped. It still doesn't. Because even now, as you listen, you are aware of the space around you. Of the silence. Of the distance between objects. Of the way your attention drifts outward when the room grows quiet. That awareness? That is what it watches. It does not need eyes. It only needs you to notice that you are being noticed. And once you do, it will never stop staring. No one pushed him. That detail matters, because later people would say he was taken, or dragged, or lured. But none of that was true. When Elias stepped into the fog, he did so calmly, deliberately, and without looking back. He chose it in the same way people choose silence when words have failed them. By the time the fog reached the center of town, everyone already understood that it wasn't random. It didn't move like weather. It adjusted. It paused. It waited for attention before deciding where to thicken next. People stood in doorways and beneath streetlights, pretending they weren't afraid, pretending they weren't aware of how closely the fog pressed toward them when they hesitated. Elias noticed this before anyone else. He said nothing about it at first. He just watched the way the mist leaned into gaps between buildings, the way it avoided open spaces unless someone stood there long enough. He noticed how it reacted when someone whispered. How it seemed to pull closer when a name was spoken aloud. Fear makes people loud. Elias understood that. He believed calm could still undo what panic had started. When someone finally said, "Someone needs to go in and see what it is," Elias didn't hesitate long enough for anyone to stop him. He stepped forward while the crowd argued. The fog waited. Streetlights dimmed as he approached, not flickering out, just lowering themselves, as if embarrassed to witness what was about to happen. The air felt heavy, not with moisture, but with expectation. Elias stopped at the edge of the fog and listened. Those closest to him later said his face changed, not with fear, but with understanding. He smiled. Not wide. Not relieved. Resigned. "I hear it," he said quietly. No one asked what he meant. They already knew better than to ask questions they didn't want answered. Elias raised one hand, palm forward, and took a step into the fog. The mist parted just enough to let him through, then closed again immediately, sealing itself behind him like a door that had been waiting to be used. He did not scream. That was the worst part. There was no sound at all, no struggle, no cry for help, no sudden violence. The fog remained still, perfectly content, as if Elias had always belonged inside it. People waited for something to happen. A shape. A shadow. Any sign that he was still there. Nothing came. Minutes passed. Then longer. The fog did not move again until someone spoke his name. It twitched. That was when people understood the truth Elias had accepted too quickly to explain. The fog did not hunt. It offered. It didn't force people inside. It waited for those who believed stepping forward would make sense of it. Those who thought sacrifice might restore order. Those who needed certainty more than safety. Elias had needed certainty. When his boots were found the next morning, they stood neatly at the edge of the street, toes pointed inward. There were no footprints leading away. No signs of struggle. Just the quiet suggestion that at some point, Elias had stopped walking and decided not to come back. After that, no one volunteered again. Because choosing the fog wasn't bravery. It was agreement. And the fog remembers everyone who agrees to it. Even now. Especially now. No one realized when it happened. That was the most merciful part of it. There was no moment of pain, no sharp transition, no clear signal that something irreversible had occurred. Life continued the way it always had. People woke up, moved through their routines, avoided the fog when they could, pretended the town still belonged to them. But somewhere inside the mist, a quiet process had begun. The fog started keeping records. It no longer reacted to everyone equally. Some people could pass near it without feeling the pressure behind their eyes, while others felt its attention snap toward them instantly, like a head turning in a dark room. The difference wasn't movement or sound. It was recognition. Windows became the first mirrors it used. Glass clouded slowly from the outside, not randomly, but in soft arcs that resembled breath pausing mid-exhale. When people wiped the condensation away, they noticed the fog returned thicker in the exact shape their hands had left behind. Fingers. Palms. Heat patterns. As if the fog had learned where to press next. Faces came later. People began to feel it when they looked outside too long. A subtle tightening in the chest. A sense that the air had leaned closer. The fog didn't form shapes, but it adjusted itself around heads, shoulders, posture. It didn't need detail. It needed structure. It needed reference. Mirrors inside homes became unbearable. Reflections lagged by half a second, not enough to be obvious, just enough to feel wrong. Some people swore their expressions changed slightly when they weren't consciously controlling them. A blink held too long. A smile that didn't quite belong to the moment. That was when the cataloging finished. You could feel it. A brief, invasive sensation, like pressure passing through your skull and out the back of your head. No pain. Just the certainty that something had completed a task. Afterward, the fog paid less attention to you. That was how you knew. Those who had been cataloged were no longer studied. They were stored. People tried to change their appearance. Haircuts. Shaved beards. Covered mirrors. Dimmed lights. It didn't matter. The fog did not remember surfaces. It remembered proportions. Bone. The way you held still when you thought no one was watching. It remembered your face the way a lock remembers a key. After that, the fog no longer pressed against your windows. It waited. Inside. People began to vanish without proximity. Without contact. Without warning. Someone would pause in a hallway, feel a sudden sense of familiarity, as if they had been expected, and then be gone. No sound. No trace. Just the lingering feeling that the space they had occupied was still being observed. The fog didn't need to surround you anymore. It had already taken note. And if you're listening carefully now, pay attention to the feeling behind your eyes. That slight awareness that your face is arranged in a particular way. That unconscious adjustment you just made, jaw relaxing, brow shifting, breath steadying. You didn't need to look into the fog for it to see you. Your face was catalogued the moment you realized it could. And once something like that knows how you are shaped, it never forgets where to find you. Silence had kept us safe longer than we deserved. Not because it stopped the fog, but because it slowed it. The fog listened. That much was clear now. It didn't just react to movement or attention, it responded to language. To sound shaped by intention. To meaning given form. Silence starved it of something it needed. We learned that too late. At first, the quiet felt unnatural. People whispered, then stopped altogether. Conversations ended in gestures. Warnings were passed with looks alone. Doors closed softly. Footsteps were measured. The town learned how to exist without announcing itself, and for a brief, fragile stretch of time, the fog seemed almost patient. Then someone spoke. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a scream or a prayer or a confession. It was a name, said out loud in frustration, in the privacy of a kitchen where someone believed themselves alone. Just one word, shaped by a human mouth, filled with recognition and intent. The fog responded immediately. Not by moving closer, but by listening better. Sound began to travel differently after that. Voices didn't echo the way they should have. Words felt heavier once released, as if the air resisted letting them go. People described the sensation as being overheard by a room that remembered everything said inside it. The fog learned cadence, tone, emotion. It learned which voices mattered. People who spoke often began to feel it most. A pressure in the throat. A dryness in the mouth. A strange hesitation before forming words, like a reflex trying to protect them from themselves. Some lost their voices entirely, not medically, but instinctively. Their throats worked. Their mouths opened. But nothing came out. Others weren't so lucky. Those who spoke in anger disappeared first. Those who raised their voices as if volume could reclaim control. The fog did not punish them violently. It accepted their words, absorbed them, and then removed the source. After that, no one doubted the rule anymore. Never acknowledge the fog. Never describe it. Never speak to it. But language is difficult to kill. People whispered prayers in their sleep. Children murmured questions they didn't understand were dangerous. Names slipped out in moments of grief. And every sound, no matter how small, seemed to tighten the fog's focus, sharpening its attention like a blade drawn slowly across skin. The worst moment came when someone tried to warn the others. They stood in the square, trembling, and shouted for silence, shouted to explain why no one must ever speak again. Their words spilled out in panic, full of urgency, full of meaning. The fog leaned in. By the time they realized what they'd done, their voice had already been taken. Their mouth kept moving, forming syllables that never reached the air. The fog wrapped around them gently, reverently, like something grateful. After that, the town understood the truth they had been circling all along. The fog did not want bodies. It wanted expression. It wanted proof that we still believed our words mattered. And now, even as you listen to this, notice how carefully you are breathing. How quiet the room feels. How aware you are of the sound your own voice might make if you spoke right now. That hesitation? That is instinct. Because speaking didn't just attract the fog. It taught it how to finish what it started. And once something has learned the language of humans, silence is no longer enough to save them. The first time it happened, no one recognized it as wrong. That was the cruelty of it. Voices are comforting by design. They carry familiarity, history, memory. When you hear a voice you know, your body reacts before your mind does. Muscles loosen. Breathing steadies. Fear steps back just long enough for something else to step forward. The fog learned that faster than anything else. It started subtly. Someone would hear their name spoken softly from another room. A husband would pause in the doorway, certain his wife had called him. A child would lift their head from bed, recognizing a parent's tone in the dark. The voices never sounded urgent. Never panicked. They sounded normal. That was how the fog refined its imitation, not by copying volume, but by copying intention. It didn't shout. It didn't whisper dramatically. It spoke the way people speak when nothing is wrong. When answering feels safe. Those who followed the voice never described fear. They described relief. The sensation of being expected. Of finally being acknowledged after days of tension and quiet. They stepped into hallways, into kitchens, into open doorways swallowed by mist, convinced they were moving towards someone who knew them. No one came back. At first, people blamed grief, stress, auditory hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and silence. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. The voices always knew exactly what to say. Not just names, but phrases, private ones. Half-finished sentences. Childhood nicknames never shared with anyone else. The fog wasn't guessing. It was replaying. It wore voices the way a parasite wears skin, poorly at first, then better with practice. Some imitations lagged slightly, syllables stretching too long, pauses lingering where no pause should exist. Others were flawless. Perfect reproductions, stripped of warmth but indistinguishable until it was too late. People began to test each other. Passwords. Call-and-response phrases. Old jokes only family members would know. It helped for a while. The fog adapted. It learned context. Learned emotional weight. Learned which memories unlocked trust and which triggered suspicion. It learned how to sound afraid. That was when the town truly began to unravel. Hearing a loved one cry for help does something violent to the human mind. It bypasses reason, overrides caution, dismantles rules that had been holding just barely. People broke their silence. They shouted names. They ran toward voices that begged them not to leave them alone. The fog welcomed them. Those who resisted suffered differently. They learned to doubt every sound, every footstep, every breath that didn't belong to them. Parents ignored voices that sounded exactly like their children. Spouses turned away from pleas they recognized too well. The guilt of survival began to rot them from the inside out. The fog didn't need to take them anymore. They were already breaking. Then it learned something new. It learned how to speak from inside the same room. People would hear their own voice respond when they hadn't spoken. Words forming themselves out loud, calm and familiar, assuring others that everything was fine. That there was nothing to worry about. That help was coming. Imagine hearing yourself lie. Imagine your voice betraying you while your mouth stays closed. Some tried to scream when that happened. Others tried to pray. But the fog had learned those sounds too, learned how desperation bends pitch and rhythm. It answered prayers in the voice of the person praying, soft and reassuring, promising relief just beyond the mist. By then, the fog no longer lingered at windows or doorways. It moved freely inside. It occupied spaces between words, between thoughts. It filled pauses in conversation with echoes that felt almost natural. People found themselves responding to voices they hadn't consciously heard, nodding, agreeing, following instructions that seemed to arrive fully formed in their minds. The fog wasn't just wearing voices anymore. It was wearing identity. Those who disappeared late were different from the first ones. They didn't resist. They didn't hesitate. They walked calmly, guided by voices that sounded like themselves on their best days, confident, certain, unafraid. The fog didn't have to drag them. It convinced them. And if you listen closely now, really listen, you may notice something unsettling. The voice reading this story in your head. The rhythm. The pauses. The familiarity of it. Ask yourself gently, does it sound like you? Because that's the final refinement. The fog doesn't need to borrow voices forever. Once it understands you well enough, once it has cataloged your shape, your silence, your attention, it can speak as you. And when something else knows how to sound exactly like your own thoughts, there is no longer a safe place to hide. The fog doesn't call anymore. It answers. And one day, very quietly, you will realize that the voice guiding you forward was never yours at all. Faith was the last thing we reached for. Not because we believed it would save us, but because everything else had already failed. Silence failed. Rules failed. Trust failed. When language itself became dangerous and voices could no longer be believed, people turned to something older than reason, something that promised meaning even when answers were gone. The fog seemed to allow it. At first, prayers went unanswered in the way prayers often do. No thunder. No signs. No miracles. But there was also no immediate punishment. People whispered blessings under their breath, traced symbols they half remembered, clutched worn books with pages softened by generations of hands. It felt safe. It felt necessary. That illusion didn't last. The first gathering happened in the old church at the edge of town, the one no one used anymore because it was too large, too empty, too honest about how small the congregation had become. Candles were lit carefully, one by one, their flames trembling as if aware they were being watched. The fog followed them inside. Not rushing. Not forcing its way through doors. It seeped in gently, respectfully, as if invited. People knelt. Heads bowed. Voices low. The prayers were cautious, stripped of desperation, spoken like apologies rather than requests. They avoided asking for salvation. They asked only for protection. For distance. For the right to be ignored. That was when the air changed. Not colder. Not heavier. Attentive. The fog gathered near the altar, thinning just enough to suggest form. Not a shape anyone could describe, but a presence that felt centered, focused, pleased. Candles nearest to it dimmed without going out, their flames bending inward, leaning the way flowers lean toward light. Someone whispered, "Amen." The fog reacted. It curved. Not sharply. Not dramatically. Gently. Like a mouth remembering how to smile. That was the moment faith died in Greyhaven, not because God failed to answer, but because something else did. The fog did not recoil from prayer. It did not fear holy words or sacred ground. It responded to them with familiarity, as if it recognized the ritual. As if it had been addressed before. People began to feel it then, a warmth behind the sternum, a pressure that mimicked comfort. The sensation of being heard. Of being acknowledged by something vast and patient. Some wept in relief. Others laughed softly, mistaking the absence of pain for grace. The fog leaned closer. Prayers grew bolder after that. Louder. People asked for forgiveness. For meaning. For explanation. They confessed sins they had never spoken aloud, believing honesty might earn protection. Each confession seemed to thicken the fog, give it weight, substance. It fed on devotion. It fed on surrender. One man stood and asked the question no one else dared to form, "What are you?" The fog stilled completely. Then, in the voice of the man's mother, long dead, perfectly remembered, it answered. Not with words. With understanding. He collapsed without a sound, smiling faintly as he hit the floor, as if reassured by something only he could hear. When people tried to reach him, the fog shifted subtly, blocking the path, not aggressively, just firmly, like a hand resting on a shoulder. The church emptied in silence. No one returned. After that night, prayer became the most dangerous act of all. Not because it angered the fog, but because it delighted it. Faith focused attention. Ritual gave structure. Devotion offered itself willingly, wrapped in hope and meaning. The fog did not want belief. It wanted submission. Even now, long after the church doors rotted shut and the candles melted into wax-stained memory, people feel it when they think about praying. A hesitation. A sense that something is listening too closely. That directing hope outward is the same as pointing a finger at yourself in the dark. Because whatever lives in the fog does not mock faith. It answers it. And when something answers prayer without eyes, without form, without mercy, you are no longer speaking to God. You are announcing yourself to something that has learned how devotion sounds. And somewhere, deep in the fog where mouths should not exist, it is still smiling. People like to believe there is a reason they survive. That belief is comforting. It turns randomness into purpose, endurance into virtue. It suggests that survival is a reward for insight, morality, or strength. When the fog had taken so many and left others behind, that idea became necessary. It was the only way people could look at themselves in the mirror without breaking. It wasn't true. The fog did not choose the living. It simply had not finished with them yet. This became obvious once the pattern stopped making sense. The kind were taken. The cruel were taken. The faithful disappeared beside the faithless. Children vanished while the elderly were ignored. There was no moral order, no hierarchy of worth. The fog did not weigh souls. It measured readiness. Those who believed they were spared began to change. They walked with a fragile confidence, speaking carefully, moving as though each step had been earned. They told themselves they had passed some invisible test. That something about them had made the fog hesitate. The fog allowed them to believe that. It watched as hope reorganized itself into arrogance. As gratitude hardened into expectation. As survival transformed into identity. People began to act like witnesses instead of participants, observers of a disaster they thought had already reached its conclusion. That was when the fog returned its attention to them. Not suddenly. Not cruelly. Methodically. It became clear then that the fog did not take people because they were special. It took them because they were available. Those who resisted, who clung to meaning, who tried to assign purpose to survival, offered something useful. They offered focus. Survival required distance. Emotional distance. Cognitive distance. Those who endured longest were not the brave or the faithful, but the detached. The ones who stopped asking why. The ones who no longer searched for patterns or lessons. They survived because they had nothing left to offer. The fog passed over them like a reader skimming a page already memorized. That realization was worse than fear. It stripped survival of dignity. People stopped telling stories about the taken. Stopped honoring the dead. Memory itself became dangerous, because remembering implied importance, and importance invited attention. Names faded. Photographs were hidden or destroyed. History was erased deliberately, as a form of camouflage. Still, the fog remained. Because erasure did not equal safety. The final truth settled slowly, like ash. There had never been a selection process. No judgment. No favor. No curse. The fog did not choose victims the way humans choose meaning. It harvested. And those left behind were not spared. They were inventory. Even now, if you believe you would have survived, if you imagine yourself smarter, quieter, more cautious than the ones who vanished, you are making the same mistake they did. You are assuming the fog is finished. You were never chosen. You were only postponed. And when something postpones you instead of taking you, it isn't mercy. It is preparation. Because the fog does not care who you are. It only cares that, eventually, you will be ready to be noticed again. You felt it before you understood it. That subtle tightening in your shoulders. The instinctive urge to adjust your posture. The awareness of space where nothing should be. Humans are not good at explaining that sensation, because it doesn't come from sight or sound. It comes from something older, something built to recognize when attention has shifted toward us. Not movement. Focus. By the time people realized the fog no longer needed to be visible, it was already too late to describe what had changed. The streets were clear. The air was thin. The town looked almost normal again. But no one felt alone anymore, even when they were. Especially when they were. The fog had learned proximity. It didn't surround people now. It positioned itself just outside perception, behind shoulders, beneath thoughts, within the small pauses between breaths. It no longer announced itself with pressure or silence. It simply occupied the space humans assume belongs only to them. People stopped turning around. Not because they were brave, but because they had learned something terrible. Every time they checked, the sense of being followed grew stronger. As if acknowledging the space behind them sharpened whatever was standing there. The fog did not chase. It stayed close. Those who tried to describe the feeling failed quickly. Language collapsed under it. Presence was too vague. Fear was too emotional. The truth was quieter. More humiliating. It felt like being allowed to continue only because something was watching how you behaved. Sleep became impossible. Not from nightmares, but from anticipation. People lay awake feeling the weight of attention settle behind them, counting breaths, waiting for the moment when stillness would be mistaken for invitation. Some turned lights on and left them on permanently. Others slept sitting upright, backs pressed to walls, believing, wrongly, that contact might prevent approach. Mirrors were covered. Doors were locked. None of it mattered. Because it was already inside the boundary. The fog didn't stand behind people. It aligned with them. People began to move differently, unconsciously adjusting their pace to match something else. Steps synchronized with nothing visible. Pauses stretched slightly longer than intended. Decisions felt delayed, as though waiting for approval that never came. That was when the final realization arrived. The fog wasn't following anymore. It was accompanying. Those who vanished at this stage didn't disappear suddenly. They faded. Became less present in conversations. Less decisive. Less anchored. Their voices softened. Their expressions dulled. It was as if something behind them had begun to lean forward, slowly overlapping, testing how much of them it could replace without being noticed. No one screamed when it happened. They simply stopped responding. And now, this is the part no one warned you about. As you listen to this, you are aware of your body. Of how you are sitting. Of where your back is in relation to the space behind you. That awareness wasn't there before. It arrived quietly, without permission. That's how it starts. You don't feel fear. You feel orientation. The sense that something has found the correct position relative to you. The sense that turning around would be unnecessary, even rude. Because nothing is hiding. It is exactly where it should be. The fog doesn't need to touch you. It only needs to remain close enough to be certain you will never feel completely alone again. So don't turn around. Not because something will be there if you do, but because it already is. and the moment you accepted that possibility, the fog stepped close enough to breathe with you. It is behind you. And it has been for some time,